Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guest is Richard Witting, a historian, and he's here today to talk about the state's eugenics program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks. Glad to be here, Scott.
First of all, did I say your name correctly?
Yeah, Richard Witting. Yeah. It's a German, so yeah, Witting.
Witting minus the H that you said everybody wants to put in it.
Everyone wants to put an H in there. Nope, that's the English.
Right. So we kind of met, like a lot of people meet these days. We met on social media, and you turned into, one of the go-to experts on a variety of topics. But today we'll talk about the eugenics program. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Richard Witting's my name. I'm a recent graduate student from UVM. I just got my master's in history. In 2016, I was at UVM. I studied anthropology. I have a background in food. I'm a chef. That's been my go-to business for most of my life. And I went back to study food and culture, but then also studied things like race, genetics, heritage. And during the pandemic, when I wasn't sure if anyone was ever gonna, need a caterer again, I decided to return to study Vermont history. I've grown up here in Vermont. I think of it as if I'm from anywhere, it's here at this point. So I went back to study Vermont history, and I was originally going to look at the food history. That was my plan. But I started, sort of chronologically at the beginning of my program by looking at the history of Indigenous people in Vermont. And there's where I ran into sort of doing this deep dive, and my path kind of changed away from food, still stayed on Vermont history, but towards understanding the first people of Vermont. And that was a good solid first year there at the program. My program was 3 years. I got the most out of it. And so, in amongst that, bring you up to eugenics here. In amongst that was the studying of the contemporary claims by the people in Vermont who identify as Abenaki, that the eugenics survey was in Vermont, specifically targeted Vermont Abenaki people. And sort of through that, I, sort of looking at and trying to answer the story or understand the credibility of those claims. I then eventually kind of switched topics to just really focusing on doing primary research with the eugenics, around eugenics, and it's the policies and practices in the state of Vermont around that. So, eugenics itself is was a movement, that came about around, it was a relative of Darwin's kind of came up with this idea of looking at evolution as it compares to humans and sort of saying, how do we take sort of evolution and genetics, which is just emerging as an idea at the end of the 1800s, how do we take hold of that with humans and, sort of eventually aim to breed better people. Now, a lot in there was a lot of British ideas of, aristocracy and breeding, and that kind of got superimposed with it. Genetics, we didn't much understand how it worked at the time, and this sort of slowly caught hold over the 1800s, late 1800s into the early 1900s, and was fairly prevalent in major thinkers in the United States, and including in Vermont. Let me take a sip here. And here in Vermont, I feel like it graphed a little bit onto, the ideas an agricultural state had about good breeding of animals, and so that kind of was percolating. And then it eventually led to sort of two main policies in the state, two main outcomes. One of them was a eugenics survey, which was roughly from the late 20s to the mid 30s, led by Henry Perkins. It often gets a lot, it's often when people think of eugenics, they think of Perkins. And, that sort of drew on these records from state institutions. So the Waterbury Mental Institution, the Brandon School for the Feeble-Minded Children, the prisons, and the Weeks School for sort of truant youths. And it sort of pulled records from there and attempted to find sort of a heritable link amongst people who are in these institutions, to sort of say families had, sort of genetic degenerate traits that were getting, passed on from generation to generation. The eugenicists and people at this time had this sort of fear that in the future, people with genetic like disorders were all the problems, and we're going to overrun the world and society was going to collapse. Almost all of which has been, disproven solidly since then. So the two things in Vermont with eugenics.
So we were kind of the precursors to. Would you say we were like the precursor to what Hitler ended up believing?
Yeah, so Hitler very much drew on eugenics. I mean, a lot of his, his worst policies were based on eugenic thinking and science. But I wouldn't draw the conclusion that they're based on ours here in Vermont. Vermont was one of, almost every state had some form of it.
Right.
And it had it in England, they had it in Europe. So Vermont, and that is kind of a thing that I feel like I understood incorrectly before I studied this, was that I had the sense that Vermont was a leader, and it wasn't really much of in this. But yes, these policies eventually would lead to contributing to the rise of Nazism, very much so. So there were two policies in Vermont, that two big policies. One was this eugenics survey record, which looked to prove that genetic problems were inheriting in Vermont families. In the end, they didn't really find that. Their sort of conclusion wasn't that was the case. The other one is that in 1932, Vermont passed a eugenics sterilization law, which essentially said that, it was called a voluntary law. And the idea of it was that if a person was deemed to be genetically unfit for some reason, the terms they used at the time were feeble-minded, insane, imbecile. These are terms now often, we might have applied to people with disabilities, but often were people, suffering from social disorders. I don't know how to say that, but people involved in crimes, or people who are suffering from poverty, or people with disabilities. So anyway, they had passed this law where if the person, their guardian, and if two doctors, surgeon, and a notary were all willing to sign and say this person should have an operation to not beget children for eugenic reasons, then such an operation would happen. So that and the survey are the two big policies. I don't know if that was a lot.
No. So who did? I know we're saving the Abenaki. Your knowledge of the Abenaki, hopefully for a different show. But sure. Since you mentioned it, did you find any correlation between the people who were sterilized and the Abenaki population, or the people who considered themselves Abenaki?
Right. So I would answer that question in those sort of two ways. I did not find in my couple years of researching this that Abenaki people were ever of interest to the eugenics survey, the eugenicists, or the targets of sterilizations. So, I mean, at all. There's really, people weren't talking about it then. They weren't thinking about Abenaki. But there is, like you just said, the complexity of it is some of the people who began in the 1970s to identify and claim to be Abenaki, they do have relatives in the eugenics survey records, but I have not found clear evidence that any of their relatives, close relatives, were ever sterilized under that law.
Another thing.
Oh, sorry. as a historian, I don't know everything, but what I'm saying from me looking at all the documentation I'm able to find and see on this, that those are the conclusions I've come to. So,
Maybe you can clarify
mhm.
this one. It's a little odd I have you here is I've written
Yep.
quite extensively about the Ku Klux Klan and the cross burnings of the 1920s and
Yep.
30s. And it hasn't been rare over the years for me to have people say to me, the self proclaimed Abenaki,
Mhm.
tell me, well, why is it when you talk about the Ku Klux Klan, you mention the French Catholics being persecuted, which did occur. And but they said, what about the Abenaki? They were actually persecuted by the Klan as well. And I'm not saying that's not true, but I haven't found any evidence of that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I will say that the history of the KKK in Vermont isn't something I've studied. There's a great, I believe, professor out there who wrote a book on that, who maybe you can ask that question to. But, you know, stepping back to the question of Abenaki, having looked at their claims, having looked through the history, as has other people, including the Attorney General, you just don't see the KKK. I don't think anyone was talking about the Abenaki because, except for the family members we know were living in Newport or in Charlotte, people back there was no idea that there were Abenaki here, so they weren't targeted because no one thought they were there. No one, as far as I know, they largely weren't there. If that makes any sense.
Right.
So, you can't target someone who essentially, you don't know is there or you don't believe is there or isn't there. So,
Yeah, I think you and I have
Yeah.
spoken a bit. We've communicated a bit about us both being in history and how sometimes we even make mistakes,
Mhm.
and we both fessed up to
Yep.
earlier chapters of our lives, taking some things that we probably should have known better,
Mhm.
and I've done that, like the hiding in plain sight thing.
Yep.
It's like, okay, yes, I did write that, and now no, that wasn't really reality. So,
Mhm. Yep.
okay, well, let's switch back to the genetics.
Sure.
So, I was listening to one of your podcasts, and it was very. And by the way, is if you ever should not decide to be a cook, or a chef,
Yep.
a history person, you could be a radio personality. You have a voice. You have a voice for radio.
Oh, thanks. That's great to hear. That was the first time ever doing it, so I tried really hard to
Oh
find it.
no, you're like, I'm sitting there like I sound like every bit of the Vermonter. Like you right now, you just have the perfect, crisp, clear um, voice, and I listened to that and I said, "Wow, he's great."
Yeah.
Um, but I listened to it, and it was about this fella who was blind. Yeah, blind.
Mhm.
And he was actually leading a pretty interesting life. Do you want to mention him?
Yeah. So to bridge from what I had said about my research to Ivor Devono, who that was about, after sort of studying the eugenic survey records, I went to the state and I asked them for the sterilization certificates that had come from these operations that had happened. There were 252 sterile certificates. And I sort of did an analysis of the data on them to sort of look at what I could see and what I could know in a big sense about where the people were from, what was their, gender, their age, were they in institutions or not. But then 44 of those people have, they've died over 50 years ago. So their names are also, were provided by the state archives. And so I was able to, I did this thing where, to me, my question became this, if not Abenaki, who was targeted by this? And what the conclusion I came to is the only way I can know that is going person to person and saying, who was this person? Looking at their genealogy, looking at what I could find in the papers, looking at any institutional records I might be able to find. And what happened was as I went along, I really was just I got sort of drawn into the biography of these people, who had been the target of a sterilization operation, but to sort of look at what is their life besides that point, right? And how did that affect them? To what degree are our ideas about who was targeted by eugenics fit onto them? And from those mini biographies I did, this idea of a podcast came to mind, that it would be great to sort of highlight these people's lives and biographies as a way to look at eugenics, and how it actually happened in Vermont, who it actually affected. And so the first episode, which we just released, I have a collaborator on that named Jules Lees, who's an educator and is super smart and tenacious, and also just a great partner. And we took, the story that jumped out to me the biggest was this guy named Ivor Devenot. He was born around the turn of the century, lived until, I believe, 1942. I don't remember dates very well, but without looking, I think he only lived into his early 20s, but he was born blind in Brandon, Vermont. He was one of, I believe, 8 children, and he had 2 siblings who were blind as well. And he was a musician. Him and his siblings went to Massachusetts to a school for the blind called the Perkins Institute, where at the turn of the century, but also they still exist, sort of train or help educate blind students, blind people. And and so Ivor went there and he learned quite a bit about music and seemed to have a big talent. He became, in this time period was this resurgence, this interest even here in Vermont in sort of cowboy music and sort of old timey, cowboy music, and think Hank Williams era feel. Right. And so he became this sort of he played on the radio and traveled around Vermont and New York a little bit as a blind guitarist, and he was covered in the papers a lot, and there was a lot of stories about him. And so then we dug deeper into his story to try and bring forward both like the good parts of his life, but also the more difficult parts, because he, besides blindness, he had other health issues like seizures. And, we tried to piece together this question of why was he sterilized? Why this person? He seemed intelligent. Was it because of his blindness or his seizures? Why and how did it affect him? He ended up, as dying by suicide only when he was about 22, I think, if I remember right. A difficult, tragic life, but also really an interesting life to be celebrated, I guess.
Right. Yeah, no, that came out to be a very good good subject, very interesting. And I think it's important that now you've kind of dispelled who the people weren't. It's interesting to find out who they were. And have you gotten any more stories?
Yeah, so we're working on our next episode, which will focus on Rutland. And in Rutland, there was this place, Rutland City, called the Rutland Colony Home for women, or for feeble-minded girls. I can't remember which title the second part is, but it was this offshoot of Brandon, and the idea was it was sort of a home environment run by a matron woman, and women would go there who were feeble-minded, right? Which was this term used at the time for people with some level of potentially disability. And the women would learn to manage their own life and go out into the world and get jobs, and but sort of have an environment that would guide them. But amongst that was the fact that a number of these women were sterilized as well. And we're still in the research phase. So, there are these questions arising about was sterilization required for this program? How many people in this program were sterilized? Was their labor being exploited? Was this actually good for them, or was this good for the state of Vermont? So that's the next one, but we do have a good list of other really interesting people to look into, with sort of different stories that highlight these different questions about why this happened. The next, or another one, notably, I really want to look into was this case of a younger man in Burlington who actually went on this sort of notorious crime wave of like thefts, and it's very covered in the newspapers that all this sort of crazy stuff happened with missing jewelry and treasure and stuff. So yeah.
You know, the one thing that struck me when I've read some of your material, I think it was you who posted or sent me material that involved the names of some of the doctors who took part.
Yeah.
Without going into names, because they were just, it was the times, but some of the names on there I recognized as the who's who of there were 2 or 3 very well-known names from right here in the greater Newport Derby area that took part in this eugenics program, as in doing the actual procedures.
Yep.
That kind of interested me.
Yeah, certainly in the book we feature, Dr. Estabrook. I don't mind naming names in the case of the doctors for sure. Who was a doctor down in him and his son were doctors down in Brandon at the Brandon School for something like 80 years. Going to Brandon, most people knew them, any older people I talked to, the Estabrooks were probably their doctor, and in general were seen as very, very good doctors and very, very loved in their community. Right. So, that rose this question in the first episode, which we're still exploring, which is, where, we want to understand who was harmed and what that harm looked like, but also how and where do we put blame for this?
Right.
And sometimes it's complicated with the doctors, as you mentioned, because surgeons versus doctors, right? The doctors, it seemed, more likely determined these operations need to happen, but the surgeons often at like almost, majority of these operations happened at UVM at the medical center. And it's still a question I don't have, is what is the culpability you'd place on a surgeon who comes to work to do that operation? But yeah, and again, with the Estabrooks, when I've looked, I haven't found a lot that says they held eugenic views, that they were sort of on this spectrum of Nazism. I don't necessarily
right.
that. But so was it's these questions of, did they have sort of bad information and thought they were doing good, right? Or were they actually using these operations at the time to sort of punish people if they were out of line in society? So
I suspect the former one is probably it. It was probably the times, and I'm not saying, I'm not being an apologist, but all right, we only have about 8 more minutes left.
Oh, wow, that was fast.
Yep. And how do you view the state's role in this? Like, didn't legislature have some kind of formal apology?
Yeah, they very much did. And our podcast opens with a focus on the state's apology. We also look at the UVM apology and also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's currently underway. And one of the main issues I feel like we are sort of looking at is where the state should put efforts at apology or reparations, right? And from my findings in this few years of research and as we dig, is like, it's these questions. I would put first disability and how people with disabilities were treated. A lot of times people with facing poverty who ended up in these programs or these institutions then became the focus of eugenics. But very often, in the state apology, you see it's more of an attempt to often find that it's related to the Abenaki or to racial groups, which, I appreciate the intent of that, because right now I think as a country or a nation, we're struggling with our history to understand how these communities were harmed. But here in Vermont with eugenics, what I see is more, it's that it's usually white people, and they're disabled, poor, more often than not women, and lack of education. So yeah. So
right. And yeah, and I think what I'm seeing too, unfortunately, uh, politicians are trying to weaponize it, as in, they bring in their own agendas and they try to create, instead of focuses on the evils, what we did,
Mhm.
they kind of turn it into a political
Mhm.
issue.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sort of using. Yeah. And that is a critique I have in there, is the use of those who were harmed in the past for an agenda now. Right. Like, is it? Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't say weaponized as much as I might say the word deployed. Right. I feel like
Right.
history is deployed for a purpose. We are interested in the past now for some reason, and what are we doing with it? And that can be used well, but you got to get your history right. I think, you got to,
Right. Right.
you don't start with the answer and then look for the history. You got to start by looking at the primary sources and documents to be like, who was harmed? Like, that should be the first question. And then you figure out who to help or apologize or, sort of deal with. So
Are there any are there any people alive today that were directly impacted
I,
by the
yeah.
earthquake?
Hmm. Yeah. So as related to the sterilizations under this law, the youngest person in this would be in their 90s, and I'm pretty sure they've all passed. So it's often more of this question of, are there even children alive? I mean, some of these people I've looked into, their great grandchildren are grandparents at this point in time. So we're sort of, I feel like we're fairly far away from direct harm, but there's always the question of intergenerational harm. But again, I think you have to get more specific and say, who are we talking about? What harm was done? Like, how do we understand that? And I don't think we're there.
All right, we only have about 3 more minutes left. Yeah, I would really, before we get off, I'd love to have you back on in the future to talk about more of your knowledge, because it's fascinating. As I said, a lot of people complain about social media, but
Mhm.
I've met some amazing people out there, and you're one of them.
Oh, thanks, Scott. You too.
So,
You too. Yeah, I agree. I love Facebook. I think it is like it's now old. It's now for like old timers at this point, but as a way to socially connect with people on subjects and find information, it's incredible. So, yeah, I'm with you.
so, so what more on this? Another couple minutes of it. What's your future? Well, is you're out of college? You're out of college now,
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I just finished
and
my
so
master's. Yeah,
are
and
you going to continue on this mission?
yeah, that's the plan. I still have sort of my regular chefing business for part of the year, but I want research to become the other half of what I do, and ideally, this podcast to take off. More people to read my thesis, which was published in the UVM History Review about eugenics and who was targeted. And yeah, I want to keep being involved in this. It's the first time I've ever, I think, been involved in something that I feel like my work is doing good or changing or helping the world. So
How
yeah,
can is there any way for people to listen to your podcasts?
yeah, it's up online now. Yep,
So
it's
where do they find it?
it's I think you can find. I think it's on. It's called "Those Who Were Harmed" is the title. And it is on Spotify. And then just one last plug also put in there, Scott, is that this is ongoing research, and we tried with Ivor, for example, we connected to his family. So when we did a premiere of this podcast in Brandon, his family members were there, and we got to hear more stories. So plug out there too, if anyone knows anything and wants to get in touch. I'm building these stories, and there are a few sterilizations in the Newport area that I will probably eventually look into. So
Okay. Hey, thank you for coming on the
yes.
show, and thank you for your amazing work. I think, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think history is going to look pretty good upon your work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, trying to just tell the truth and bring things to light. So appreciate
Okay.
it. All right, Scott, take care.
Thank you, and thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.